The courtroom doors swung open with a force that made everyone turn their heads, and there he stood, Damon Wright, billionaire real estate mogul, dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His lawyer, Bernard Hastings, walked beside him carrying a briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain the weight of 1,000 legal battles. Damon's face wore an expression that could only be described as predatory satisfaction, the kind of look a hunter gets when the prey is already trapped and bleeding. He scanned the courtroom with cold, calculating eyes until they landed on her, his wife of 12 years, Naomi Wright, sitting alone at the defendant's table with nothing but a yellow legal pad and a pen that looked like it came from a hotel lobby. If you're watching this, make sure you stay until the end because what happens next will leave you speechless. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because stories like these remind us that karma doesn't forget an address. Damon's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he leaned toward Bernard, whispering something that made his lawyer chuckle, a sound that echoed through the marble-floored courtroom like nails on a chalkboard. Naomi didn't look up, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, even though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped that cheap pen. The gallery was packed with reporters, social media influencers, and curious onlookers who had heard about the divorce case that was being called the trial of the decade in Atlanta's high society circles. Everyone wanted to see how the billionaire would dismantle his wife, the woman he'd once claimed to love, the woman who had stood by him when he was just a struggling contractor with more dreams than dollars. Damon walked past Naomi's table deliberately, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the floor with each measured step, and he paused just long enough to let out a theatrical sigh. "No lawyer, Naomi? Really?" His voice dripped with mock concern, loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear, loud enough for the reporters to scribble furiously in their notebooks. "I offered to make this easy for you, baby. I offered you the settlement. But you wanted to be stubborn, wanted to play the victim, wanted to act like you built my empire with your own two hands." He laughed then, a sound devoid of warmth, devoid of any memory of the woman he'd married in a small church in South Atlanta when neither of them had anything but hope in each other. Bernard placed a hand on Damon's shoulder, a gentle reminder to maintain decorum. But Damon shrugged it off because this was his moment, his stage, his opportunity to remind everyone in that room who had the power. Naomi's jaw tightened, her brown eyes still fixed on the legal pad in front of her, but anyone paying attention could see the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her breathing became more deliberate, more controlled. The judge hadn't even entered yet, and already Damon was performing. Already he was establishing dominance. Already he was making sure that everyone knew this wouldn't be a fair fight. The spectators whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disgust, others leaning forward with the kind of morbid fascination people have when watching a car crash in slow motion. You know what the saddest part is? Damon continued, now addressing the room more than Naomi, playing to his audience like the narcissist he'd become. "She thinks she deserves half of everything I built. Half of my hotels, half of my investments, half of my blood, sweat, and tears. But what did she contribute? What did she actually do except spend my money, live in my houses, and enjoy the lifestyle I provided?" His words were carefully chosen, each one designed to paint Naomi as a gold digger, a freeloader, someone who had ridden his coattails to wealth and now wanted to cash out. The reporters ate it up, their phones recording every word, every gesture, already crafting headlines that would trend on social media within the hour. Bernard finally managed to guide Damon to their table, the plaintiff's side, where manila folders were stacked in neat piles, evidence, financial records, testimonies from people Damon had paid handsomely to say whatever he needed them to say. Naomi still hadn't looked up, still hadn't acknowledged his presence, and somehow that infuriated Damon more than if she had screamed or cried or begged. He wanted a reaction, needed a reaction, because her silence made him feel like he wasn't as important as he believed himself to be. The bailiff entered through the side door, and everyone stood automatically, the sudden movement creating a wave of sound, chairs scraping, fabric rustling, throats clearing. But before the judge could enter, before the bailiff could announce "all rise," the courtroom doors opened again, this time slowly, almost hesitantly, and an elderly black woman stepped inside. She was small, probably no more than 5'3", with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun that sat at the nape of her neck. Her face was a roadmap of years lived, of struggles survived, of wisdom earned through experience rather than books. She wore a simple navy dress, the kind you'd find at a department store rather than a boutique, and sensible shoes that suggested practicality over fashion. But there was something about her presence, something in the way she carried herself, that made people pause and take notice. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her eyes scanning the room until they found Naomi, and then her expression softened into something that looked like both love and determination. Naomi's head snapped up for the first time since entering the courtroom, her eyes widening in disbelief, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words coming out. "Mama," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions: shock, relief, confusion, hope. The elderly woman reached Naomi's table and placed a weathered hand on her daughter's shoulder, squeezing gently, and in that gesture, something shifted in the atmosphere of the courtroom. Damon turned to look, his smug expression faltering for just a moment before he recovered, before he dismissed this interruption as irrelevant. "Who's this?" he called out, loud enough to be disrespectful, loud enough to show that he considered this woman beneath his notice. "Your mama come to hold your hand? That's touching, Naomi, really touching. But she can't help you now. This is a court of law, not a family reunion." Bernard whispered something urgent in Damon's ear, but Damon waved him off, too confident in his victory to care about protocol or propriety. The elderly woman turned to face Damon, and for the first time, he saw her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and utterly unintimidated by his wealth or his bluster. "My name is Grace Thompson," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone her age, carrying clearly across the courtroom without her having to raise it. "And I'm not here to hold my daughter's hand." She reached into a worn leather bag she'd been carrying and pulled out a thick folder, the kind that had clearly been assembled with care, with documents organized and tabbed and prepared for exactly this moment. "I'm here to represent her." The courtroom erupted in whispers, reporters frantically typing, spectators leaning forward to see what would happen next. Damon's face went from confident to confused to angry in the span of 3 seconds. "You?" He laughed, but it sounded forced now, hollow. "You're going to represent her? Are you even a lawyer? Do you have any idea what you're walking into, old woman?" Grace Thompson didn't flinch at the insult, didn't show any sign that his words had landed. She simply opened her folder, pulled out a document, and held it up for everyone to see. "I graduated from Howard University School of Law in 1975, she said calmly, matter-of-factly. "I practiced civil rights law for 30 years before I retired. And yes, Mr. Wright, I know exactly what I'm walking into. The question is, do you?" The judge entered at that moment, and everyone stood again, but Damon couldn't take his eyes off the elderly woman who had just transformed from a harmless interruption into something that looked dangerously like a threat. As everyone sat down and the judge prepared to begin proceedings, Grace Thompson opened her folder and pulled out a document that made Bernard Hastings lean forward, squinting, trying to read what it said. What could possibly be in that folder that would make a billionaire's confidence start to crack? Don't click away now. You need to see what happens when this mother reveals a truth that Damon thought he'd buried forever. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what you think is in that folder, because next chapter is going to blow your mind. The judge, a stern-looking black woman in her early 60s named Judge Patricia Morrison, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the papers before her with a kind of expression that suggested she'd seen every courtroom drama imaginable and wasn't impressed by theatrical entrances or designer suits. She had a reputation in Atlanta for being fair but unforgiving, the kind of judge who could smell manipulation from a mile away and had zero tolerance for lawyers who thought money could buy verdicts. "Before we begin," Judge Morrison said, her voice cutting through the lingering whispers like a blade through silk, "I need to establish representation. Mr. Wright, I see you're represented by Bernard Hastings of Hastings & Associates. Mrs. Wright, you've just indicated that Grace Thompson will be representing you. Ms. Thompson, please approach the bench with your credentials." Grace walked forward slowly, deliberately, her sensible shoes making soft sounds against the marble floor, and handed Judge Morrison a manila envelope that looked like it had been prepared years ago, waiting for exactly this moment. Damon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth because he figured this was just a delay tactic, just an old woman trying to help her daughter save face before the inevitable defeat. Bernard Hastings, however, wasn't smiling. He was watching Grace Thompson with the kind of careful attention a chess player gives an opponent who's just made an unexpected opening move. Judge Morrison opened the envelope, pulled out several documents, and spent what felt like an eternity reading them, her expression never changing, never giving anything away. The courtroom was silent except for the soft rustle of paper and the occasional call from someone in the gallery who couldn't handle the tension. Ms. Thompson. Judge Morrison finally said, looking up from the documents, I see here that you were admitted to the Georgia Bar in 1975, practiced for 30 years specializing in civil rights and contract law, and retired in good standing in 2005. However, your license has been inactive for nearly 20 years. Are you aware that you need to be reinstated to practice law in this state? Grace nodded calmly, as if she'd expected this exact question. Yes, Your Honor. I filed for reinstatement 3 months ago, and my application was approved 2 weeks ago. The documentation is in that envelope. Judge Morrison flipped through more pages, found what she was looking for, and nodded slowly. Everything appears to be in order. Ms. Thompson, you are recognized as counsel for the defendant. Please take your seat. The judge's words hit Damon like a physical blow. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped expression of someone who just realized the game might not be as one-sided as he'd anticipated. Bernard immediately leaned over and whispered urgently in Damon's ear, probably advising him to stay calm, to not show any emotion, to trust in the mountain of evidence they'd prepared. But Damon couldn't help himself. He turned to look at Naomi, really look at her for the first time since entering the courtroom, and saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not resignation, but something that looked dangerously like hope. Grace returned to the defendant's table, squeezed Naomi's hand once more, and then opened a folder with a kind of methodical precision that suggested she knew exactly where every single document was located. The reporters in the gallery were typing furiously, their headlines already shifting from Billionaire's wife shows up without lawyer to mysterious mother emerges as legal surprise in Atlanta's biggest divorce. Judge Morrison shuffled her papers and looked out at both tables with an expression that suggested she was about to establish ground rules. This is a divorce proceeding with significant assets involved. Mr. Wright is seeking to retain full control of his business empire, valued at approximately $2.3 billion, while offering Mrs. Wright a settlement of $5 million and no ongoing support. Mrs. Wright is contesting this settlement and seeking equitable distribution of marital assets. Mr. Hastings, you may present your opening statement. Bernard stood, buttoned his jacket with practiced ease, and walked to the center of the courtroom like an actor taking center stage. He was good. Everyone knew he was good. He'd won cases that seemed impossible, defended corporations that deserved to lose, and had a winning record that made him one of the most sought-after lawyers in the Southeast. Your Honor, members of the court, what we have here is a straightforward case of matrimonial law. My client, Damon Wright, built his empire from nothing. He started with a single construction crew and through sheer determination, brilliant business acumen, and countless hours of sacrifice, he created Wright Development Corporation, which now owns 17 luxury hotels, 43 commercial properties, and has a portfolio worth billions. During his marriage to Naomi Wright, he provided her with every comfort, homes, cars, jewelry, travel, a lifestyle that most people can only dream about. She wanted for nothing. However, when the marriage deteriorated due to irreconcilable differences, Mr. Wright made a generous offer, $5 million, which is more than most people will earn in multiple lifetimes. But Mrs. Wright rejected this offer, claiming she's entitled to half of everything. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mrs. Wright made no financial contributions to the business, held no official position in any of Mr. Wright's companies, and essentially enjoyed the fruits of his labor without planting any seeds. We asked the court to uphold the prenuptial agreement that both parties signed before marriage and to recognize that my client's offer is more than fair. Bernard returned to his seat with the confidence of someone who believed he'd just delivered a knockout punch in the first round. Damon nodded approvingly, his earlier anxiety fading as he remembered all the evidence they had, all the documents that proved Naomi had been nothing more than a decorative wife, a pretty face at charity events, someone who spent his money but never earned a dime of her own. Judge Morrison turned her attention to Grace, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Ms. Thompson, your opening statement. Grace stood slowly, not with the theatrical flair of Bernard Hastings, but with the quiet dignity of someone who didn't need to perform because the truth was performance enough. She didn't walk to the center of the courtroom. She stayed right where she was, at her daughter's side, one hand resting on Naomi's shoulder. Your Honor, my colleague Mr. Hastings has painted a very interesting picture, a picture of a self-made man who generously provided for a wife who contributed nothing. It's a compelling narrative, and I'm sure it will play well in the media. But it's also a lie. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun, and suddenly every eye in the courtroom was locked on Grace Thompson. The truth, Your Honor, is that Naomi Wright didn't just contribute to her husband's empire. She made it possible. And I'm not talking about being a supportive spouse or hosting dinner parties, though she did that too. I'm talking about tangible, provable, financial, and intellectual contributions that Mr. Wright has gone to great lengths to erase from the record. I'm talking about a prenuptial agreement that was signed under duress and contained clauses that violate Georgia state law. I'm talking about assets that were acquired during the marriage using joint funds but titled only in Mr. Wright's name. And most importantly, Your Honor, I'm talking about fraud. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shot to their feet. Cameras flashed despite the bailiff's protests, and Damon's face went from confident to crimson in seconds. That's a damn lie, he shouted, jumping up from his chair so fast it nearly toppled backward. Your Honor, this is outrageous. She can't just come in here and accuse me of fraud without any evidence. Judge Morrison slammed her gavel 3 times, the sharp crack echoing through the room like gunshots. Mr. Wright, sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt. This is my courtroom, and you will respect the proceedings. Damon sat, but his hands were clenched into fists on the table, his breathing heavy, his carefully constructed composure completely shattered. Bernard was whispering urgently to him, trying to calm him down, but Damon wasn't listening. He was staring at Grace Thompson like she just set his world on fire and was standing there watching it burn. Grace remained perfectly calm, her expression unchanged, as if she'd expected exactly this reaction. Your Honor, I have documentation to support every claim I've just made. Financial records, witness testimonies, communications between Mr. Wright and his business associates, and most damning of all, she paused, reaching into a folder and pulling out a single document that she held up for everyone to see, a recorded conversation between Mr. Wright and his accountant discussing how to hide marital assets from his wife in anticipation of divorce. A conversation that took place 2 years ago, long before Mr. Wright filed for divorce, proving premeditation and intent to defraud. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Judge Morrison looked surprised, her eyebrows raised slightly as she gestured for Grace to approach and submit the document into evidence. Naomi was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of finally being believed after years of being told she was crazy, paranoid, imagining things. Damon looked like he'd been punched in the gut, all the color draining from his face as he realized that the secrets he thought he'd buried were about to be excavated in front of the entire world. Stay tuned, because this case is about to get even more explosive. If you're loving this story of karma and justice, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss next chapter, where we'll reveal exactly what Damon tried to hide and how Naomi's mother got her hands on evidence that could destroy him. Judge Morrison took the document from Grace's weathered hands and studied it with the intensity of someone reading a death sentence, her eyes scanning line by line while the entire courtroom sat frozen in anticipation. The only sound was the gentle hum of the ventilation system and the occasional click of a camera shutter from reporters who couldn't resist capturing this moment despite the bailiff's stern warnings. Damon sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, his eyes darting between the judge, his lawyer, and the woman who had just produced evidence that could unravel everything he'd spent 2 years carefully constructing. Bernard Hastings had stopped whispering urgent advice and was now frantically typing on his tablet, probably messaging his paralegal team to dig up whatever countermeasure they could find. But his face betrayed what his professional demeanor tried to hide. This was bad, potentially catastrophic. Naomi watched her mother with a mixture of awe and confusion, because she had no idea how Grace had obtained this recording, had no idea her mother even knew about the hidden assets, had no idea that the woman who raised her in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in South Atlanta had been quietly building a case that could take down one of the city's most powerful men. Grace stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, waiting patiently for the judge to finish reading. And there was something almost serene about her posture, as if she'd carried this burden for so long that finally releasing it felt like setting down a weight she'd been holding for years. The reporters in the gallery were practically vibrating with excitement, their fingers hovering over keyboards and phone screens, ready to blast this development across every social media platform the moment court recessed. Ms. Thompson, Judge Morrison finally said, looking up from the document with an expression that was carefully neutral but couldn't quite hide a glimmer of something that might have been respect. This document indicates a recorded phone conversation between Mr. Wright and someone identified as Trevor Hudson, dated March 15th, 2024. Can you authenticate this recording and explain how it was obtained? Grace nodded and pulled out another folder, this one marked with color-coded tabs that suggested meticulous organization. Your Honor, Trevor Hudson was Mr. Wright's personal accountant for 8 years, from 2016 until last month when Mr. Wright terminated his employment. The circumstances of that termination are relevant to this case. Mr. Hudson contacted me 6 weeks ago after reading about the divorce proceedings in the newspaper. He indicated that his conscience had been troubling him regarding certain financial maneuvers he'd been instructed to perform, and he wanted to ensure that justice was served. The recording was made by Mr. Hudson during a routine business call. Georgia is a one-party consent state for recordings, Your Honor, which means only one party in a conversation needs to be aware of a recording for it to be legal. Mr. Hudson has provided a sworn affidavit confirming the authenticity of this recording and is currently sitting in this courtroom, prepared to testify. Grace gestured toward the gallery, and a thin black man in his mid-40s wearing glasses and a rumpled suit stood up slowly, looking nervous but determined. Damon's head whipped around so fast it was a miracle he didn't get whiplash, and the look he gave Trevor Hudson was pure venom, the kind of look that promised retribution if he ever got the chance to deliver it. Trevor's hands were shaking, but he met Damon's glare with surprising defiance, the look of a man who decided that his integrity was worth more than his fee. Judge Morrison gestured for Trevor to approach, and he walked down the aisle with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield, very aware that every eye in the courtroom was tracking his movement. Mr. Hudson, the judge said once he'd been sworn in, please state your relationship to the plaintiff. Trevor cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a voice that started shaky but grew steadier with each word. I was Damon Wright's personal accountant and financial advisor from January 2016 until he fired me on November 28th of last year. During that time, I managed his personal finances, handled tax preparation, and advised him on various investment strategies. In March of 2024, approximately 18 months ago, Mr. Wright called me with specific instructions regarding asset protection in anticipation of a potential divorce. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. He told me that his marriage was falling apart and that he needed to ensure his wife wouldn't get one damn penny more than absolutely necessary. Those were his exact words. He instructed me to create a series of offshore accounts, to transfer significant assets into corporate entities that appeared unrelated to him but were actually controlled through various shell companies, and to backdate certain documents to make it appear as though these assets had been acquired before the marriage or through inheritance rather than during the marriage's marital property. Bernard shot to his feet like he'd been launched from a catapult. Your Honor, I object. This is hearsay, And furthermore, attorney-client privilege. Mr. Hudson was an accountant, not an attorney, Mr. Hastings. Judge Morrison interrupted coldly. There is no accountant-client privilege in criminal matters, and if fraud occurred, any such privilege would be void anyway. Sit down. Bernard sat, but he looked like he wanted to flip the table. Trevor continued, his confidence growing as he realized the judge was actually listening, actually taking him seriously. Over the course of the next year, I helped Mr. Wright move approximately $340 million into accounts and holdings that wouldn't appear in any standard asset disclosure. He purchased properties in the Cayman Islands through a corporation based in Delaware that was owned by another corporation based in Panama. He transferred ownership of 4 commercial buildings in Atlanta to his cousin's name, with a secret agreement that the cousin would transfer them back after the divorce was finalized. He even created a false paper trail suggesting that a $15 million yacht was a business expense rather than a personal asset, claiming it was used exclusively for client entertainment when I personally know he used it for personal vacations at least a dozen times. Trevor pulled out his own folder, this one stuffed with papers, bank statements, transfer records, emails, and text messages. I have documentation of every transaction, every conversation, every instruction Mr. Wright gave me. And I have this. He held up a small digital recorder, the kind you could buy at any electronics store. This recording from March 15th, 2024, when Mr. Wright explicitly states his intention to hide assets from his wife and asks me to help him commit what is legally classified as fraud. I kept this recording as insurance, honestly, because I was afraid that if anything went wrong, he'd blame me and I'd end up in prison while he walked away free. But when he fired me last month without cause, without severance, after 8 years of loyal service, just because I questioned whether some of his recent instructions were legal, I decided that maybe Mrs. Wright deserved to know the truth. The entire courtroom seemed to collectively inhale, and Naomi pressed both hands over her mouth, fresh tears streaming down her face, because hearing it spelled out like this, hearing someone validate what she'd suspected for so long, was almost overwhelming. Damon exploded. He shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward, his face contorted with rage. You snake! You backstabbing, ungrateful snake! I made you. I gave you a career. You were nothing before me, working in some strip mall tax preparation office, and I elevated you, paid you 6 figures, and this is how you repay me? By lying in court? By fabricating evidence. Judge Morrison's gavel came down like thunder. Mr. Wright, one more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom, and this case will proceed without you. Do you understand me? Damon was breathing hard, his chest heaving, but Bernard had grabbed his arm and was forcibly pulling him back into his seat, whispering urgently that he was destroying his own case with every word. Grace remained calm throughout the entire outburst, and once Damon had been restrained, she addressed the judge again. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence not only Mr. Hudson's testimony in the recording, but also these financial documents that corroborate every claim he's made. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts, corporate filing documents, email correspondence between Mr. Wright and various associates discussing the asset concealment strategy. Furthermore, I'd like to point out that hiding marital assets in anticipation of divorce is not only grounds for awarding my client a greater share of the marital estate, it's also potentially criminal fraud. The court may wish to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation. The implications of those words hit Damon like a freight train. This wasn't just about losing money in a divorce anymore. This was about potentially facing criminal charges, about the empire he'd built potentially crumbling not because of business failure, but because of his own arrogance and greed. Bernard was now engaged in a heated, whispered conversation with Damon, probably explaining just how deep the hole they were standing in had become. Judge Morrison looked at the mountain of evidence Grace had presented, then at Trevor Hudson, who stood there looking both terrified and relieved, then at Damon, who looked like he wanted to murder everyone in the courtroom. We're going to take a 30-minute recess while I review these documents in my chambers. When we return, Mr. Hastings, I suggest you be prepared to explain your client's financial disclosures, because based on what I'm seeing here, there are some significant discrepancies. Court is in recess. The gavel came down, and suddenly everyone was moving, talking, the reporters rushing for the doors to file their stories. And in the chaos, Damon turned to look at Naomi one last time. What he saw in her eyes wasn't fear or sadness anymore. It was something that looked dangerously like victory. This story is getting more intense by the minute. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth always comes out. Hit that subscribe button because next chapter is where everything truly falls apart for Damon, and you won't believe what else Grace has up her sleeve. The 30-minute recess felt like an eternity and a heartbeat all at once, stretched thin by anticipation and weighted heavy with the knowledge that everything was about to change. Naomi sat in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and for the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to really breathe. Grace sat across from her, methodically organizing documents back into their respective folders with a kind of calm efficiency that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times before, even though Naomi knew her mother had been retired for nearly 2 decades. "Mama," Naomi finally said, her voice cracking with emotion she'd been holding back since Grace walked through those courtroom doors. "How did you know? How did you get all of this?" "I never told you about the offshore account because I wasn't even sure they existed. I just had this feeling, the suspicion that Damon was hiding something, but I had no proof, no evidence, nothing but intuition." Grace looked up from her papers, and the expression on her face was a mixture of maternal love and something harder, something that looked like the determination of a warrior who'd been preparing for battle for a very long time. "Baby, I've known Damon was poisoned since the day you brought him home 12 years ago," she said quietly, reaching across the table to take Naomi's hand. "I saw the way he looked at you, not like a man who loved you, but like a man who saw an opportunity. You were beautiful, educated, connected to the right family through your father's church, and most importantly, you believed in him when nobody else did. He needed you to build his image, to open doors that were closed to a rough contractor from the West Side. But I also saw the way he changed once he got what he needed, the way he started treating you like an accessory instead of a partner, the way he isolated you from your friends, from me, from anyone who might remind you that you deserve better." Naomi felt tears burning behind her eyes again because her mother was right. She had allowed herself to be isolated, had convinced herself that Damon's jealousy was love, that his control was protection, that his dismissiveness was just the stress of building an empire. "When you called me 6 months ago, crying because Damon had served you with divorce papers and was offering you practically nothing after 12 years of marriage, I knew I had to do something." Grace continued, her grip on Naomi's hand tightening. "I started making calls to old colleagues, lawyers I'd worked with back in the day who still practice. I hired a private investigator, used up most of my retirement savings to do it. But some things are worth more than money. The investigator found Trevor Hudson, found out that Damon had recently fired him under suspicious circumstances, and we approached him carefully. At first, he was too scared to talk, worried about retaliation, worried about being sued. But when we showed him the legal protections available to whistleblowers, when we explained that staying silent made him complicit in fraud, he made the right choice." Grace pulled out a tissue and handed it to Naomi, who hadn't even realized she was crying openly now. "I spent the last 3 months getting reinstated to the bar, preparing this case, gathering every piece of evidence, tracking down every hidden account. I did it quietly because I knew if Damon caught wind of what we were building, he'd find a way to destroy it. And I did it because you're my daughter, and I'll be damned if I let some arrogant man take everything you helped build and then throw you away like trash." The words hung in the air between them, and Naomi felt something inside her chest break open, not in pain, but in relief, in gratitude, in the overwhelming realization that she wasn't alone, had never been alone, even when she felt most isolated. A knock on the door interrupted the moment, and the bailiff stuck his head in. 5 minutes, ladies. Judge Morrison is ready to reconvene." Grace stood, smoothed down her navy dress, and picked up her folders with the same calm determination she'd shown all morning. Naomi stood too, wiping her eyes, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something that might have been hope, fragile and tentative but real. They walked back into the courtroom together, and immediately Naomi noticed a change in atmosphere. The reporters looked hungry, predatory, like sharks who'd smell blood in the water. The spectators leaned forward in their seats. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next, and Damon sat at his table looking smaller somehow, diminished, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked like barely contained panic. Bernard Hastings was surrounded by 3 associates who hadn't been there before the recess, all of them whispering urgently, passing documents back and forth, clearly trying to mount some kind of defense against the avalanche of evidence Grace had buried them under. When Grace and Naomi took their seats, Damon didn't even look at them. He stared straight ahead, his jaw working, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Judge Morrison entered, and everyone rose automatically, the sudden movement like a wave through the crowded courtroom. Once everyone was seated again, the judge looked directly at Bernard Hastings with an expression that could freeze boiling water. Mr. Hastings, I've had the opportunity to review the evidence submitted by Ms. Thompson during the recess. I have several questions about your client's financial disclosures, which were filed with this court 8 weeks ago. Specifically, I'd like to know why none of the offshore accounts, shell corporations, or transferred properties mentioned by Mr. Hudson appear anywhere in those disclosures. Bernard stood slowly, and for the first time since Naomi had known him, he looked genuinely uncomfortable, like a man trying to defend the indefensible. Your Honor, I can only speak to the information my client provided to me when preparing those disclosures. If there were assets that weren't reported, that would be an oversight on Mr. Wright's part, not a deliberate attempt to mislead the court. It was a weak defense, and everyone knew it. Bernard was essentially throwing his own client under the bus to protect himself from potential disciplinary action. Damon's head snapped toward his lawyer, betrayal written all over his face, but Bernard refused to meet his eyes. Judge Morrison's expression didn't change. An oversight? Mr. Hastings, we're talking about $340 million in assets. That's not an oversight. That's either gross negligence or deliberate fraud, and I'm inclined to believe it's the latter. Ms. Thompson, do you have anything to add before I make my preliminary rulings? Grace stood, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 decades of fighting for justice in courtrooms just like this one. Your Honor, I'd like to present one more piece of evidence that speaks directly to Mr. Wright's character and his intentions in this divorce. She pulled out a thin folder that Naomi had never seen before, one that hadn't been part of the earlier presentation. 6 years ago, in 2020, my daughter suffered a miscarriage. It was her 3rd pregnancy loss, and the doctors told her that due to complications, she would likely never be able to carry a child to term. This was devastating for Naomi, who had always wanted to be a mother. She fell into a deep depression, spent months in therapy, and leaned on her husband for support during the darkest period of her life. Grace's voice remained steady, but Naomi could hear the undercurrent of rage beneath the professional calm. What my daughter didn't know at the time was that her husband saw her infertility not as a tragedy to grieve together, but as a liability to his social standing and his dynasty. I have here text messages between Mr. Wright and his mistress. Yes, Your Honor, there was infidelity, which is also grounds of favorable divorce terms under Georgia law. Text messages where he explicitly states that he's stuck with a broken wife who can't even give him an heir, and that is counting down the days until he can trade her in for a newer model. The courtroom gasped collectively, a sound like air being sucked out of the room all at once. Naomi felt like she'd been slapped, even though she'd suspected Damon's infidelity for years. Hearing it stated so bluntly, seeing the evidence of his cruelty laid bare, was almost unbearable. Grace continued, her voice harder now, edged with the kind of anger only a mother protecting her child can summon. These text messages spanned 3 years, Your Honor, from 2021 to 2024, and they paint a picture of a man who not only cheated on his wife but mocked her pain, belittled her suffering, and planned her disposal like she was a business asset that had depreciated in value. Furthermore, during this time, while my daughter was struggling with grief and depression, Mr. Wright was actively dating multiple women, spending marital funds on expensive gifts for these women, and even purchasing a condominium in Buckhead that he used exclusively for extramarital affairs, a condominium that, surprise, surprise, Doesn't appear anywhere in his financial disclosures because it's titled under one of his shell corporations. Grace walked forward and handed the folder to Judge Morrison, who took it with an expression that had moved from stern professionalism to barely concealed disgust. The judge read through the messages, her lips pressing into a thinner and thinner line with each page, and when she finally looked up at Damon, it was with a kind of contempt that suggested she'd seen the worst of humanity in her courtroom, but this somehow still managed to disappoint her. Damon sat frozen, his face ashen, because he absolutely knew, that this was a moment everything fell apart. Not just a divorce case, not just his carefully constructed public image, but everything. Bernard was frantically whispering to him, probably advising him to say nothing, to not make it worse. But how could it possibly get worse than this? The reporters were recording every second. Social media was probably already exploding with leaked details, and by tomorrow morning, Damon Wright's name would be synonymous with cruelty, greed, and betrayal. Judge Morrison closed the folder slowly, deliberately, and looked at both tables. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, Mr. Wright, and I advise you to think very carefully before answering. Did you knowingly omit assets from your financial disclosure to this court?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by thread, and everyone in the courtroom knew that however Damon answered, he was finished. If he said yes, he'd admitted to fraud. If he said no, he'd be caught in a provable lie given all the evidence Grace had presented. Damon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then looked at Bernard with an expression of desperate pleading, like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver that wasn't there. Bernard gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. There was no good answer, no escape hatch, no clever legal maneuver that could save him now. Damon started, his voice rough. "I may have forgotten to include some business holdings that I didn't consider marital property because they were—" "Stop," Judge Morrison interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse like a knife through butter. "Mr. Wright, you just admitted under oath that you omitted assets from your disclosure. Whether you forgot or did it deliberately is irrelevant. The result is the same. You attempted to defraud this court and your wife. I'm hereby ordering a complete forensic audit of all your financial holdings, business and personal, dating back to the date of your marriage. I'm also freezing all your assets pending completion of this audit, which means you will not be able to sell, transfer, or liquidate any properties, accounts, or holdings until this matter is resolved. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. Do you understand the gravity of what I'm telling you?" Damon's face had gone from ashen to a sickly green color, and he nodded mutely, unable to form words. Naomi felt her mother's hand find hers under the table and squeeze gently, and she squeezed back, watching the man who had controlled every aspect of her life for 12 years finally face consequences for his actions. Oh, this is just the beginning of Damon's downfall. Make sure you hit that like button and drop a comment with the word justice if you think he's getting exactly what he deserves. Subscribe and turn on that notification bell because next chapter is going to show you the final courtroom showdown and Naomi's ultimate victory. 3 weeks had passed since Judge Morrison dropped the hammer on Damon Wright's empire, and the fallout had been nothing short of apocalyptic. The forensic audit team had torn through his finances like a hurricane through a paper house, uncovering not just the $340 million Trevor Hudson had testified about, but an additional $180 million in assets that even Trevor hadn't known existed. Properties in Monaco, investments in tech startups routed through Singapore, a private jet owned by a shell company in Luxembourg, and a sprawling estate in the Bahamas that Damon had purchased using funds siphoned from his own company's operating accounts. The media had turned Damon into Atlanta's most hated man practically overnight, with headlines screaming about the billionaire who tried to leave his wife with nothing and real estate mogul's house of cards collapses in stunning divorce trial. His business partners had started distancing themselves, investors were pulling out of deals, and 3 of his hotel properties were facing potential foreclosure because he couldn't access his frozen accounts to make payments. Bernard Hastings had withdrawn from the case entirely, citing irreconcilable differences with the client, which was lawyer speak for "my client lied to me and made me look like a fool in court," and Damon was now represented by a younger, less experienced attorney named Jason Webb, who looked perpetually overwhelmed and underprepared. Today was a final hearing, the day when Judge Morrison would issue her ruling on the division of assets, and the courtroom was even more packed than it had been 3 weeks ago. Standing room only, with people literally pressed against the walls hoping to witness the conclusion of what had become Atlanta's most talked-about legal drama in decades. Naomi walked into the courtroom with her mother beside her, and this time she didn't look like a woman who'd been beaten down by years of emotional abuse and gaslighting. She wore a tailored burgundy suit that she'd purchased with money from a joint account she'd opened years ago that Damon had forgotten existed. Her natural hair was styled in elegant twists pulled back from her face, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been through hell and come out the other side stronger. Grace walked beside her in another simple but dignified dress, this time in charcoal gray, carrying the same worn leather bag that had become almost famous in Atlanta legal circles. People were calling her the Mother of Justice on social media, and there was already talk of her coming out of retirement to take on other cases involving powerful men trying to cheat their wives. They took their seats at the defendant's table, and Naomi allowed herself to look across the aisle at Damon for the first time in 3 weeks. What she saw shocked her. The man who had always been impeccably groomed, who had spent hundreds of dollars on haircuts and thousands on custom suits, who had projected an image of untouchable power and success, now looked haggard and defeated. His suit was off the rack, probably purchased in a hurry from a department store because all his custom pieces were being held as evidence of excessive spending. His face was drawn, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't been sleeping, and his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers on the table in front of him. His new lawyer, Jason Webb, looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else, his face pale and sweaty despite the courtroom's aggressive air conditioning. The mighty had fallen, and the fall had been spectacular. Judge Morrison entered right on time, her black robe flowing behind her like the wings of an avenging angel, and everyone rose with a practiced synchronization of people who'd been through this routine before. Once everyone was seated, the judge didn't waste time with pleasantries or preamble. She opened a thick folder that contained the forensic audit report and began speaking in a voice that carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "I have reviewed a complete forensic audit of Mr. Wright's financial holdings, and I must say that in my 23 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more egregious attempt to defraud both a court and a spouse in divorce proceedings." The audit revealed a total marital estate valued at approximately $2.7 billion. That's $400 million more than Mr. Wright originally claimed his entire net worth to be. Of that $2.7 billion, Mr. Wright attempted to hide $520 million through various illegal schemes, shell corporations, and fraudulent transfers. He spent an additional $8.7 million on extramarital affairs during the marriage, including purchasing property, jewelry, vehicles, and vacation expenses for multiple mistresses. He also withdrew $3.2 million from joint accounts and business accounts that should have been disclosed as marital property. The judge paused, looking directly at Damon with an expression of pure judicial contempt. "Mr. Wright, your behavior in this matter has been reprehensible. You not only tried to cheat your wife out of her rightful share of the marital estate, but you lied under oath, submitted fraudulent documents to this court, and showed a pattern of financial abuse and manipulation that speaks to a fundamental lack of character and integrity. Therefore, I am ruling as follows." The courtroom seemed to hold a collective breath, and Naomi felt her mother's hand find hers under the table. "First, regarding the division of assets," Judge Morrison continued, her voice taking on the formal tone of someone issuing a binding legal judgment. "Given Mr. Wright's intentional dissipation of marital assets through extramarital affairs, his fraudulent concealment of property, and his bad faith conduct throughout these proceedings, I'm awarding Mrs. Naomi Wright 65% of the total marital estate. This amounts to approximately $1.755 billion. Mr. Wright will retain 35%, approximately $945 million, which is still substantially more than the $5 million he originally offered his wife. Mrs. Wright will have first choice of which asset she wishes to retain, including but not limited to the marital home in Buckhead, the vacation property in Hilton Head, and controlling interest in 3 of Mr. Wright's hotel properties. Mr. Wright will be responsible for all tax liabilities associated with the asset transfers. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Damon looked like he'd been physically struck, his face going pale, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish drowning in air. Jason Webb was scribbling frantically on his legal pad, probably trying to figure out if there was any possible avenue for appeal. But the judge wasn't finished. Second, regarding spousal support, given the length of the marriage, the disparity in owning capacity, and Mrs. Wright's contributions to Mr. Wright's business success, which the evidence clearly established despite Mr. Wright's attempts to minimize them, I am ordering Mr. Wright to pay spousal support in the amount of $250,000 per month for a period of 10 years. This is non-modifiable and non-terminable, meaning Mr. Wright cannot petition to reduce or eliminate this obligation regardless of changes in circumstances, and the obligation continues even if Mrs. Wright remarries. Third, Mr. Wright will be responsible for all of Mrs. Wright's legal fees, which currently total approximately $380,000, including the cost of the private investigator, the forensic audit, and Ms. Thompson's fees for representation. The judge looked up from her papers, and her expression softened slightly as she addressed Naomi directly. Mrs. Wright, I want you to know that your courage in fighting this battle, despite being outmatched financially and initially without legal representation, is commendable. No one should have to endure what you've endured. The betrayal, the cruelty, the systematic attempt to diminish your worth and erase your contributions. This court sees you, acknowledges your pain, and is endeavoring to provide some measure of justice. I hope this ruling allows you to begin healing and rebuilding your life. Naomi felt tears streaming down her face, but these were different from the tears she cried over the past 3 weeks, over the past 2 years, over the past 12 years of her marriage. These were tears of relief, of vindication, of finally being seen and heard and believed. Grace squeezed her hand tightly, and Naomi could see that her mother was crying too, decades of worry and anger and protective fury finally releasing now that her daughter was safe. Judge Morrison then turned her attention back to Damon, and her expression hardened again into something that looked like granite. Mr. Wright, I am also formally referring this matter to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The evidence presented in this case suggests multiple violations of Georgia law, including fraud, perjury, and potentially tax evasion. Those are matters for criminal court to decide, but I want you to understand that your actions in this courtroom have consequences that extend far beyond the division of assets. You attempted to use your wealth and power to destroy someone who trusted you, who built a life with you, who supported you when you had nothing. That kind of betrayal deserves more than just financial penalties. It deserves the full weight of the law. Damon finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse croak. Your Honor, please, I'm not interested in your excuses, Mr. Wright. Judge Morrison interrupted coldly. You had multiple opportunities to do the right thing. You could have been honest in your financial disclosures. You could have offered your wife a fair settlement. You could have shown even a shred of decency or remorse. Instead, you chose to lie, to cheat, to mock your wife in open court, confident that your money and your lawyers will protect you from consequences. You were wrong. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Reporters rushing for the exits to file their stories, spectators turning to their neighbors to discuss what they'd just witnessed, and at the plaintiff's table, Damon Wright sat motionless, staring at nothing, as the empire he'd built through ruthlessness and ambition crumbled into dust around him. Naomi turned to her mother and collapsed into her arms, sobbing openly now, all the pain and fear and anger and relief pouring out in waves that shook her entire body. Grace held her daughter tightly, stroking her hair, whispering words of comfort and pride and love, and for a moment, the chaos of the courtroom faded away and there was just a mother and daughter who had fought together and won. When Naomi finally pulled back, wiping her eyes and trying to compose herself, she saw Trevor Hudson standing a few feet away, looking nervous but hopeful. Mrs. Wright, he said quietly, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for my part in all of this. I should have come forward sooner. I should have refused to help him in the first place. But I hope that by telling the truth, I help make this right." Naomi nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and Grace stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Hudson, your testimony was crucial to this case. You made a brave choice, and my daughter and I are grateful. I hope you're able to rebuild your career with your integrity intact." Trevor smiled, relief washing over his features, and nodded before disappearing into the crowd. As people filed out of the courtroom, Naomi caught one last glimpse of Damon being let out by his lawyer, and what she felt wasn't triumph or satisfaction or even anger. It was pity. He had everything and threw it all away because he couldn't see the value in the person standing right beside him. He had built an empire but destroyed his own humanity in the process. And now he would spend the rest of his life trying to rebuild from rubble of his own making, while she would be free. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed him with cameras and microphones, shouting questions about how it felt to win, what she planned to do with the settlement, whether she forgave her ex-husband. Grace efficiently guided Naomi through the crowd to a waiting car, shielding her from the worst of the chaos. But before they got in, Naomi turned back to face the cameras. "I just want to say one thing," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "To anyone out there who's in a relationship where they feel diminished, controlled, or told they're worthless, you are not worthless. You deserve respect, honesty, and love. And if you're not getting those things, you deserve the courage to walk away. Thank you." She got into the car with her mother, and as they pulled away from the courthouse, driving toward a future that was uncertain but finally haze, Naomi felt something she hadn't felt in over a decade. She felt like herself again. We're almost at the end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because next chapter is the emotional conclusion where we see Naomi truly begin her new life and Damon face the full consequences of his actions. Drop a comment and tell us what you think Naomi should do with her new freedom. 6 months after the final judgment, Naomi stood on the balcony of her new penthouse overlooking the Atlanta skyline, watching the sunset over the city that had witnessed both her greatest pain and her ultimate redemption. The penthouse was haze, truly haze, not shared with a man who made her feel small, not tainted by memories of betrayal and cruelty, just haze. She had chosen it carefully, taking her time to find a space that felt like possibility rather than prison, and the moment she walked through the door for the first time, she knew she was home. The walls were painted in warm earth tones that made her feel grounded. The furniture was comfortable rather than ostentatiously expensive, and every room held something that brought her joy. Books she'd always wanted to read, art from black artists whose work spoke to her soul, photographs of her mother and the few friends who had stood by her through the darkest times. She had learned something profound during those 12 years with Damon and the brutal months of the divorce, that wealth without peace was just another form of poverty, that a mansion filled with tension was smaller than a studio apartment filled with love, that you could have everything the world said mattered and still be dying inside. Now, standing here with a glass of wine in her hand and the city lights beginning to twinkle below her like earthbound stars, Naomi felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. She felt content. Not the manic, desperate happiness that comes from trying to convince yourself everything is fine when it's falling apart, but the deep, quiet contentment of someone who has survived a storm and learned to appreciate the sunshine. Her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Don't forget dinner tomorrow. I'm making your favorite. Love you, baby." Naomi smiled, typed back a quick response, and felt her heart swell with gratitude for the woman who had saved her life in every way that mattered. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of change, of decisions both terrifying and exhilarating, of learning who she was when she wasn't constantly walking on eggshells or trying to become whoever Damon wanted her to be that particular day. She had started therapy with Dr. Patricia Williams, a black woman psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery and emotional abuse, and those weekly sessions had been more valuable than any amount of money. Dr. Williams had helped her understand that the woman who had allowed herself to be diminished, controlled, and isolated wasn't weak. She had been systematically manipulated by someone who was an expert at finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them. "You survived," Dr. Williams had told her during one particularly difficult session when Naomi was beating herself up for not leaving sooner. You survived a relationship with someone who saw you as an object to be used rather than a person to be loved. That takes incredible strength, even if it doesn't feel that way. And now you're not just surviving, you're learning to thrive. That's remarkable. Naomi had also reconnected with friends she'd lost during the marriage, reaching out with apologies for disappearing, for canceling plans, for choosing Damon's comfort over their friendship. To her surprise and relief, most of them welcomed her back with open arms, understanding that she hadn't abandoned them by choice but had been slowly isolated until she didn't know how to reach out anymore. Her best friend from college, Shanice, had cried when they finally met for coffee, holding Naomi's hands across the table and saying, "Girl, I never stopped praying for you. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help. I'm just so glad you're free." They had spent 3 hours in that coffee shop, catching up, laughing, crying, and slowly beginning to rebuild what had been broken. Naomi had also started volunteering at a women's shelter downtown, using her experience and her resources to help other women escape abusive relationships, and there was something healing about turning her pain into purpose, about using the worst chapter of her life to help write better endings for others. The financial settlement had been life-changing in ways both obvious and unexpected. Naomi had chosen her assets carefully with the help of a financial advisor Grace had recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Keisha Brown, who had immediately impressed Naomi by treating her like an intelligent adult rather than a confused child who needed things explained slowly. Together, they had built a portfolio that would provide security for the rest of Naomi's life while also allowing her to pursue passions that didn't generate income. She had kept the Buckhead house initially, but sold it 3 months later because she couldn't walk through those rooms without feeling ghosts of arguments, silent treatments, and slow suffocation. Instead, she purchased a penthouse and invested the difference. She had taken controlling interest in 2 of Damon's hotels and immediately promoted several longtime employees who had been overlooked because they didn't fit Damon's image of what leadership should look like. Under her direction, both properties had actually increased in profitability because she had implemented the kind of employee-first policies that led to better service, lower turnover, and genuine hospitality rather than the cold, corporate efficiency Damon had valued. She had also started a foundation called Second Chances that provided legal assistance, counseling services, and financial support to women going through difficult divorces, particularly women who were being bullied by wealthy spouses into accepting unfair settlements. Grace served on the board, of course, and they had already helped 37 women in 6 months, 37 women who might have been steamrolled by expensive lawyers and intimidation tactics, but instead got the support they needed to fight back. Every time Naomi signed a check to help another woman hire a good lawyer or escape an abusive situation, she felt like she was rewriting the ending of her own story over and over again, making the pain mean something beyond just personal suffering. Damon, on the other hand, had not fared well in the months since the judgment. The criminal investigation had resulted in formal charges, 3 counts of fraud, 2 counts of perjury, and 7 counts of tax evasion. He had hired a team of expensive criminal defense attorneys who were doing their best to minimize the damage, but the evidence was overwhelming and most legal experts predicted he would end up with at least some prison time, likely 2 to 5 years if he took a plea deal, potentially much longer if he insisted on going to trial and lost. His business empire had contracted dramatically. Investors had pulled out, business partners had terminated relationships, and 3 of his hotels had been sold at significant losses to cover legal fees and tax penalties. He was still wealthy by any reasonable standard, but the untouchable billionaire who had walked into that courtroom 6 months ago confident he could buy his way out of any consequence was gone, replaced by a man facing the very real possibility of wearing an orange jumpsuit and being known as inmate rather than Mr. Right. Naomi had heard through mutual acquaintances that he was living in a much smaller house now, that his social circle had shrunk to almost nothing, that the women who had been so eager to be seen with him when he was powerful had disappeared the moment his power started to crumble. She didn't take pleasure in his suffering exactly. She wasn't the kind of person who could enjoy watching anyone's life fall apart, even someone who had hurt her so deeply. But she did feel a sense of cosmic balance being restored, of the universe correcting an injustice. He had tried to leave her with nothing, to discard her like trash after using her to build his image and his empire, and instead he had lost everything while she had gained not just wealth but something infinitely more valuable, She had gained herself back. The most surprising development had come 2 weeks ago when Naomi received a letter forwarded through Jason Webb. It was from Damon, handwritten rather than typed, and the handwriting was shaky, uncertain, nothing like the bold, aggressive signature he used to scroll across contracts and divorce papers. The letter had said, "Naomi, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to even read this. But I need to say these things whether you hear them or not, because I need to face what I've done. You were right about everything. I did use you. I did see you as a tool rather than a person. I did mock your pain and treat your suffering like it was an inconvenience to my plans. I told myself I loved you in the beginning. But looking back now, I don't think I ever knew what love was. I knew what advantage looked like, what opportunity looked like, what a good investment looked like, and that's how I saw you, not as my wife, not as my partner, but as an asset that could open doors and improve my image. When you couldn't give me children, I told myself that justified my betrayal, that you had failed to deliver on your side of the bargain, but that was a lie I told myself to avoid feeling guilty. The truth is, I would have cheated anyway because I'm selfish and broken in ways I'm only beginning to understand now that everything's been stripped away. Losing my money, losing my business, even facing prison. Those consequences are hard, but they're not the worst part. The worst part is looking in the mirror and seeing a man who destroyed the one person who actually believed in him when he had nothing. You loved me when I was nobody, and I repaid that love with cruelty and betrayal. I don't know if I'm capable of change, if I'm capable of becoming someone better, but I'm going to try because the alternative is living the rest of my life as the man I was, and that man was a monster. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. You deserved respect, honesty, partnership, and genuine love. I hope you find all of those things with someone who can actually appreciate the gift of your heart. I'm sorry, Naomi, for everything. Damon." Naomi had read the letter 3 times, sitting on her balcony much like she was now, and her feelings about it were complicated. Part of her was angry that he thought a letter could somehow balance the scales, that words on paper could undo years of emotional abuse and manipulation. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger through therapy and healing, recognized that the letter wasn't really for her. It was for him, an attempt to face his own demons and maybe, possibly, begin the long process of becoming a better person. She didn't respond to the letter. She didn't think she owed him that. But she also didn't throw it away. She kept it in a drawer, a reminder that even people who hurt us deeply are still human, still capable of recognizing their failures, still capable of regret even if they are not capable of redemption. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon and Atlanta's night lights took over, Naomi heard her doorbell ring and went to answer it, already knowing who it would be. Grace stood in the hallway holding a bag of groceries and wearing a smile that made her look 20 years younger. "I know I said dinner was tomorrow, but I was in the neighborhood and I thought, why not cook for my baby tonight?" Naomi laughed and pulled her mother into a tight hug, breathing in familiar scent of cocoa butter lotion and the faint smell of the vanilla candles Grace always burned in her house. They moved into the kitchen together, and as Grace unpacked groceries and started pulling out pots and pans, they fell into the comfortable rhythm they developed over the past 6 months. Grace cooking, Naomi chopping vegetables and setting the table, both of them talking about everything and nothing, about the Foundation's latest success stories, about the book Naomi was thinking about writing, about whether Grace should teach a class on family law at Emory University since several professors had reached out to her. "You know what I'm proudest of," Grace said suddenly, pausing in the middle of seasoning chicken to look at her daughter with eyes that shimmered with emotion. "Not that we won the case, not that we took down a man who deserved it, but that you survived, that you're standing here in your own home, living your own life, being yourself again. When you called me 6 months ago crying about those divorce papers, I heard something in your voice that terrified me. I heard someone who was giving up, who was accepting that she deserved to be thrown away. But you didn't give up. You fought. And now look at you." Naomi felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mama. You saved me." Grace shook her head firmly. "No, baby. I gave you tools and support, but you saved yourself. Don't ever forget that. You had the courage to walk into that courtroom and face a man who had all the power, all the money, all the advantages. You had the strength to let the truth be told even when it was painful and humiliating. You saved yourself. I just made sure you had backup. They cooked together in comfortable silence for a while, and then sat down to eat dinner as the city sparkled below them. Two women who had fought a battle, and one not just in court but in the deeper, harder battle of reclaiming dignity, identity, and hope. Later, after Grace had gone home and Naomi was alone again, she stood on her balcony one more time, looking out at the city that held so many memories, some beautiful, many painful, all of them part of the tapestry that had made her who she was. She thought about the woman she had been 12 years ago, young and in love and full of dreams. She thought about the woman she had become during the marriage, smaller and quieter and slowly disappearing. And she thought about the woman she was now, scarred but stronger, wiser but still capable of joy, wounded but healing. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Shanice. Girls' night this Friday? And before you say you're busy, the answer is yes. We're going dancing. It's been 12 years since you let loose and had fun, so consider this an intervention. Naomi smiled and typed back, I'll be there, and meant it. She was ready to laugh again, to dance again, to be silly and spontaneous and all the things she'd forgotten how to be. The future stretched out before her like an open road, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Naomi wasn't afraid of what came next. She had survived the worst, had faced the demons, had reclaimed her power. Whatever came next, new love, new adventures, new challenges, she would face it as herself, whole and free and unbreakable. The billionaire had mocked her for having no lawyer, confident that she stood no chance against his money and his power. But he had underestimated two things, a mother's love and a woman's strength. And that miscalculation had cost him everything while giving her back the one thing that mattered most, herself. Thank you so much for watching this powerful story of justice, redemption, and new beginnings. If Naomi's journey inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of courage and triumph. Drop a comment below and tell us, what would you do with a fresh start and a second chance at life? Remember, you are never too broken to heal, never too lost to find your way home, and never too defeated to rise again. See you in the next story.